Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm talking about Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is probably one of, if not the most famous and influential horror work of all time, which in a lot of ways kind of makes it difficult to even start to talk about. It's fighting some pretty unfair expectations when comparing it to other horror books because Dracula did not have itself as a reference point. It lays a lot of the groundwork for the genre as a whole by itself. Like, this might be the first ever book that's actually scary. A lot of times Frankenstein is credited as the first ever horror novel, and while I think Frankenstein is a phenomenal book, I always found it to be more dark and sad and bleak than scary, like in a horror sense. Dracula, on the other hand, does have a lot of genuinely scary moments and is able to create an effectively scary atmosphere. Now, I don't think it necessarily sustains its horror throughout the entire duration of the book. There are certainly parts of this book that are much more effective than others, but again, I think this might literally be the first time anyone ever did this. This book is written in an epistolary format, so it largely consists of journal entries, letter correspondences, newspaper articles, and other documents relating to the story somehow. This used to be a much more common novel format in general around the 19th century when this book was written, but I found it to fit this story quite well. There are a lot of core characters in this book, and the format allows you to get multiple first-person perspectives of the events as they are unfolding. And on top of that, I think it just makes the book feel very immersive. A lot of times when books are narrated in the first person, there's no real justification or reason for the story to exist. Like, a character is just kind of relaying the events in a vacuum. Here, there's a lot of meta functionality for these things to be written down. The characters are writing these journal entries, then sending them to one another to get everyone up to speed. The record keeping itself is an important part of the story. And the newspaper articles and sales receipts and shipping logs and those other kinds of supporting documents really make the story feel authentic in an interesting way. Now, to speak on the actual narrative, this story has three relatively distinct acts. The book is not officially laid out in this way, but to me it's pretty clear. The first act is, in my opinion, by far the best and most interesting part of the novel. It begins with the journal entries of Jonathan Harker as he recounts his travels to Count Dracula's castle in Transylvania in order to assist with some real estate transaction. Transylvania, of course, is not a real place, but based on the geographic details provided, is pretty much just Romania. Bram Stoker does a phenomenal job of rendering the beauty of the Carpathian Mountains as Jonathan travels through all these picturesque landscapes and quaint villages, but pretty quickly some unsettling elements are introduced. The villagers he encounters seem terrified at the notion of traveling to Count Dracula's castle, to the point where they plead him not to go and give him crucifixes to bring along and whatnot. His long journey ends in the middle of the night when he finally arrives at the Count's castle, which is enormous and dark and isolated. And over the course of the next few days, Jonathan gets to know Count Dracula, who himself is a very unsettling man. He is extremely pale, but with super red lips. He has weirdly sharp teeth and fingernails. He has an almost reptilian presence about him, and in addition to all that, he also displays a variety of strange behavior. He seems to only be around at night. He refuses to eat with Jonathan. He is overly polite and yet subtly threatening. Jonathan realizes eventually that all the doors to the castle are locked and that there's no way out, and that he's effectively a prisoner of the castle. At one point, he notices the Count's reflection does not appear in his shaving glass, and then he has some dreams of these creepy vampire ladies trying to suck his blood in the middle of the night. And then the final straw is when he sees the Count crawl out of his window down the vertical walls of the castle wearing Jonathan's own clothes, which leads him to believe the Count is planning on doing some nefarious things while using his identity. He eventually escapes by scaling down the castle wall himself, and from here the book abruptly transitions into what I would consider to be the second act. This part of the book primarily focuses on a woman named Lucy Westenra. She is coincidentally the best friend of Jonathan Harker's wife, Mina, who is another important character in the story. Lucy has suddenly come down with some strange illness, and as her health deteriorates, her friends and family become increasingly concerned and increasingly desperate to help her. Two physicians are called in to assist. There's Dr. John Seward and Dr. Abraham Van Helsing. They realize upon inspection that for some mysterious reason, Lucy seems to be losing a substantial amount of blood pretty much every night. She has to get several blood transfusions to stay alive, the feasibility of which I question, given the existence of blood types and whatnot, but I don't think those had been discovered yet when this book was written. But eventually Van Helsing realizes the cause is supernatural, and although he doesn't come out right away and say it, he knows it's a vampire. This is where I'm personally a little bit unclear, how much vampire lore already existed at this time versus how much was invented or popularized by Bram Stoker, because clearly the concept already existed in traditional European folklore, and that's what Van Helsing is drawing his ideas from. But remedies like filling the room with garlic, cleansing things with crucifixes and holy wafers, and vampires feeding off human blood for sustenance, I think a lot of that lore is established within this book, but I actually don't know. A couple other characters come into the fold at this point. Namely, there's this cowboy guy named Quincy Morris, as well as Arthur Holmwood, aka Lord Godalming, confusing. Both of these guys, as well as Dr. John Seward, have an interesting thing in common, which is that all three recently asked Lucy Westenra to marry them. She ends up picking Arthur, aka Lord Godalming, but throughout the rest of the story, the other two still love her and are still extremely devoted to her. One of a couple relationship dynamics in this book that feel a bit strange and kind of antiquated, but it's not super distracting. This section of the book was not quite as enthralling to me as the first, but there are still many very eerie moments that I enjoyed, specifically with Lucy sleepwalking through Whitby and wandering through the foggy church graveyard in the middle of the night. There's also this super creepy scene involving a mysterious empty cargo ship that came to shore during a severe thunderstorm with nothing on board besides one corpse. Lucy eventually succumbs to the vampire, and later the gang has to go to her grave in the middle of the day so that she's actually in the casket to, chop off her head, drive a wooden stake through her heart. Classic vampire killing sort of stuff. And unfortunately, after this, the story slows down quite a bit. I thought the third act was the most arduous to get through. Mina gets bitten by the vampire as well, and the gang has to come together to track down and kill Dracula before Mina's transformation can take full effect. This sounds intense, but it was very slow moving. Mina's vampiric illness was pretty much identical to Lucy's, but happened at a much slower pace since Dracula had fled back home by this point. There was a lot of sifting through real estate documents, having long conversations, talking to random docksmen to track down the progress of Dracula's ship. Just lots and lots of waiting, only for the inexorable climax to happen in just a couple of pages with very little fanfare. The weird, antiquated dynamic between Mina and the boys was a lot more apparent as well, with them constantly musing on how, this is way too dangerous for such a small woman. You should just stay here and take notes of everything. And Mina just being fully content with that. I still enjoyed certain aspects of this part as well. I love the second journey through the Carpathian Mountains with Mina and Van Helsing's anxiety-filled travelogues and seeing the same beautiful area again, but in the late fall instead of the spring. But most of this section was a bit of a slog for me. As a whole, though, I thought Dracula was a fascinating book. It's interesting to look at the space that Dracula occupies in the overarching culture compared to what he's actually like in the book, which is a lot closer to a strange man than a horrifying monster. That said, for a book of its age, I thought it did a fantastic job of establishing a genuinely creepy atmosphere. I thought Bram Stoker crafted some genuinely interesting characters. Van Helsing was so eccentric and funny, and I haven't even mentioned Renfield, the asylum patient whose system of feeding flies to spiders, then feeding those spiders to birds, then intending to feed those birds to cats, thinking that by consuming this hierarchy of creatures, he would somehow absorb their accumulative life force. Just a brilliantly crafted character. I also really appreciated the amount of empathy throughout this book to everyone and everything. The main characters love and respect each other to an almost excessive degree, but more than that, they're even empathetic towards Dracula himself. They recognize him as a soul who is suffering, and even though they're trying to hunt and kill him, they are also trying to help him and release his spirit. Even though the end of this book felt a bit dry, part of that I do think is a result of this book being one of the first to do what it does. An ensemble cast of characters slowly coalesces in order to work together to defeat some evil creature is a trope at this point. But in 1897, it was probably still a very novel concept. So no matter what, you kind of have to respect this book for laying the groundwork that it did and for being as effective as it is for a book of its age. I'm going to give Dracula a strong 8.